The dirt under Louisa Jane's boots hadn't been dry in 3 days, but neither had her throat known water for nearly as long. She stood outside the sprawling ranch house in Fairplay, Colorado, watching the sun climb over the rocky peaks of the South Park Basin in the summer of 1876, wondering if desperation had finally driven her to accept whatever scraps men decided to throw her way. The journey from Denver had taken every cent she'd saved working in the textile mill before it closed, and now her stomach gnawed at itself with a hunger that made her hands shake. The rancher, a thick-necked man named Sutton with eyes like dirty ice, had looked her up and down twice before spitting tobacco juice near her feet. He told her he needed help with the horses, someone who could gentle them and work the breaking pens. Louisa had grown up on a small farm in Missouri before her parents died of scarlet fever, and she knew horses better than most men twice her age. She'd told him as much, keeping her voice steady despite the way his gaze made her skin crawl. "I'll pay you $8 a month," Sutton had said, crossing his arms over his chest, "plus room in the bunkhouse with the other hands." Louisa had felt her heart sink. The men working his ranch would make at least $20 a month, maybe more for the experienced wranglers. $8 wouldn't even cover her basic needs, let alone allow her to save anything for the future she'd been trying to build since leaving Missouri 2 years ago. "That's not fair wages for the work you're describing," she'd said, hating the tremor that crept into her voice. "I can break and train horses as well as any man you've got." Sutton had laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "Take it or leave it, girl. There's plenty of others who'd be grateful for the opportunity." She'd opened her mouth to argue further when another voice cut through the morning air, deep and measured as a river stone. "The lady's right. That's an insult, not a wage." Louisa had turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the mountain trail that wound up into the high country beyond Sutton's property. He was easily the tallest man she'd ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to block out the rising sun behind him. His hair, dark brown and wavy, hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a warm brown that held something genuine in them, something she hadn't seen in a long time. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt that strained across his chest and arms, muscles clearly defined even through the fabric. "This doesn't concern you, Fletcher," Sutton said, his voice hardening. "Get off my property." The man, Fletcher, didn't move. He kept his gaze steady on Sutton, and Louisa noticed his hands, large and calloused, resting calmly at his sides. "I'm hiring if the lady's interested. $16 a month plus room and board in a proper cabin. I need help managing my stock, and someone who knows horses would be valuable." 16, Louisa had heard herself say before she could stop herself. That was double what Sutton had offered, and from the way Fletcher stood there, solid and certain, she believed he meant it. "Could go to 18 if you're as good as you say," Fletcher added, his eyes moving to her for the first time. There was no judgment in his gaze, no calculation or assumption. He looked at her like she was a person, not a problem to be solved or a thing to be used. "I've got 20 head of horses up at my place, another 30 cattle. It's hard work, but it's honest work, and I pay fair." Sutton's face had gone red. "You can't just come down here and poach my workers." "She's not your worker," Fletcher said simply. "You haven't hired her yet, and from what I heard, you were trying to cheat her. Now, madam, what do you say?" Louisa had looked between the two men, her mind racing. She didn't know Fletcher from Adam, but she knew Sutton's type well enough. She'd seen men like him back in Denver, men who thought a woman's labor was worth half what a man's was simply because of her sex, men who would work her to the bone and still find reasons to dock her pay. "I'll take your offer, Mr. Fletcher," she'd said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "When do I start?" "Right now, if you're ready. My place is about 5 miles up into the high country. We can load your things on my pack horse." She'd had so few things that it barely took 5 minutes to gather them from where she'd left them outside Sutton's property. Fletcher had produced a sturdy mare, a beautiful chestnut with kind eyes, and helped Louisa secure her bedroll and small trunk. Sutton had stood watching, fury radiating off him like heat from a stove, but he hadn't said another word. The ride up into the mountains had been quiet at first. Louisa rode the chestnut while Fletcher led his own horse, a massive gray gelding that matched its owner's size. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, the air growing cooler and cleaner with each passing mile. Louisa found herself relaxing despite her uncertainty, something about the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, and the solid presence of Fletcher walking ahead calming her frayed nerves. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said as they crossed a small stream, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. "Back there, I mean. Intervene." Fletcher glanced back at her, and she saw what might have been a smile beneath his beard. "Couldn't let him rob you like that. Sutton's known for taking advantage of people who don't have other options. Figured you deserved better. You don't even know if I'm any good with horses." "I watched you check that mare before you mounted her," he said. "You looked at her teeth, her hooves, ran your hand down her legs checking for heat or swelling. Most folks would just climb on. You know what you're doing." Louisa felt a flush of pleasure at the observation. It was such a small thing, but it meant he'd been paying attention, that he valued skill and knowledge. "My father taught me," she said. "Before he died, we had a small farm, only a few horses, but he made sure I learned everything." "Good teachers are hard to find," Fletcher said. "My father was the same way. Taught me everything about surviving up here in the high country." "How long have you been up here?" "Built my cabin 3 years ago. Came out here from Illinois after the war. Needed space and quiet, I guess. The mountains provided both." Louisa did the mental arithmetic. The war had ended in 1865, 11 years ago. That would make Fletcher around 30 if he'd been old enough to fight, maybe a bit younger. She was 22 herself, old enough that people back in Missouri had started calling her a spinster before her parents died. They crested a ridge, and Fletcher pointed ahead. "There it is." The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a small barn and several corrals visible beyond it. A stream ran along one side of the property, and Louisa could see the horses Fletcher had mentioned grazing in a large fenced pasture. The cabin itself was solid, built from thick logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. It was small, probably just 2 rooms, but it looked well maintained and sturdy. "It's beautiful," Louisa said honestly. The mountains rose up behind the cabin, their peaks still holding snow even in July. The air smelled of pine and wildflowers, and she could hear birds singing in the trees. "Your cabin is that one there," Fletcher said, pointing to a smaller structure about 50 yards from the main house. It was newer, the logs still golden rather than weathered gray. "Built it last year thinking I might need to hire help eventually. It's got a stove, a bed, and a table. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." Louisa stared at the cabin, something tight in her chest loosening, a place of her own. She'd been sharing rooms with other women in boarding houses for 2 years, never having any privacy or peace. "That's mine, just mine. Long as you work for me, yes, madam. I believe people do better work when they have their own space. I'll take my meals in my cabin, you take yours in yours unless the weather's bad or you'd prefer company. Up to you." They dismounted, and Fletcher helped her unload her things. Up close, Louisa could see he was even larger than she'd first thought. easily 6.5 feet tall with arms thick as fence posts. But his movements were gentle as he handled her belongings, and he was careful not to stand too close or make her uncomfortable. "Let me show you the barn and introduce you to the horses," he said, once her things were inside the cabin. "Then we can talk about the work schedule and make sure we're both clear on expectations." The barn was as well maintained as everything else, with fresh straw in the stalls and tack hanging neatly on the walls. The horses, when Fletcher led her out to meet them, were a mixture of working stock and what looked like breeding animals. Louisa ran her hands over their legs, checked their teeth and eyes, and felt her respect for Fletcher grow. These animals were well cared for, healthy and alert. "You know what you're doing," she said, echoing his earlier words to her. "I try, but I'm better with cattle than horses, truth be told. That's why I need help. I want to build up the horse stock, sell trained animals to the army and to ranchers who need good working horses. But I don't have the skill for the training part, not really. I can break them, but I can't gentle them proper." "I can do that," Louisa said, confidence filling her voice. "I can work with them so they're not just broken but actually trained, responsive and reliable. That's what I'm hoping for. Now let's talk wages proper. $18 a month paid at the end of each month. Room and board included, which means you're welcome to whatever food I have. I go into Fairplay once a week for supplies, and you can come along if you need anything. Sundays are yours to do with as you please. Work starts around dawn and ends at dusk with a break midday. Does that sound fair?" Louisa nodded, almost dizzy with relief. It was more than fair. It was generous. "When Mr. Sutton was offering $8, I thought that was all I could hope for." Fletcher's expression darkened. "Sutton's a thief and worse. He's been warned by the sheriff more than once about how he treats his workers. Most of his hands don't last more than a month before they realize he's cheating them on pay. I'm sorry you had to deal with him." "I'm not," Louisa said. "If I hadn't, I wouldn't have found this place." Something shifted in Fletcher's eyes, a warmth that made Louisa's heart skip unexpectedly. "Then I'm glad for that too, Miss Jane. Louisa, please. If we're going to be working together, no need for formality." "Louisa," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "I'm Fletcher Barnes. Most folks just call me Barnes, but you can use whichever you prefer." "Fletcher suits you better," she said without thinking, then felt her cheeks heat. "I mean, it's a good name." He smiled, a real smile this time that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Fletcher it is, then." They spent the rest of that first day establishing a routine. Fletcher showed Louisa where everything was kept, from the feed supplies to the tools she'd need for working with the horses. He introduced her to the cattle, a mixed herd of longhorns and shorthorns that grazed on the high meadow above the cabin. They talked about his plans for the property, how he wanted to expand slowly but sustainably, building a reputation for quality stock. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Fletcher started toward his cabin. "I'll let you get settled in. If you need anything, don't hesitate to knock. Otherwise, I'll see you at dawn." Louisa stood outside her cabin watching him go, this massive man who moved with surprising grace despite his size. She realized she felt safer than she had in years, here in the middle of the wilderness with a man she'd just met. There was something about Fletcher that inspired trust, a fundamental decency that seemed to radiate from him. That night, lying in the small but comfortable bed in her cabin, Louisa listened to the sounds of the mountains. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, and the wind whispered through the pines. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like she might have found a place where she belonged. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only exists in the high country. Louisa was up before dawn, washing her face in the cold stream water and braiding her dark blonde hair back from her face. She dressed in her work clothes, sturdy trousers and a shirt she'd modified to fit her properly, and made her way to the barn. Fletcher was already there, forking hay into the stalls. He looked up when she entered and nodded a greeting. "Morning. Coffee's on in my cabin if you want some before we start." "That sounds perfect," Louisa admitted. She'd used the last of her coffee grounds 2 days ago and had been missing the morning ritual. Fletcher's cabin was larger than hers, but just as tidy. The main room held a kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area with a fireplace. She could see a doorway that led to what must be a bedroom beyond. Everything was simple but well made, the furniture sturdy and functional. He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and she wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The morning was cold, even in July this high up in the mountains. "I thought we'd start with the 3-year-old gelding," Fletcher said, pouring his own coffee. "He's got good lines, but he's skittish. Previous owner didn't treat him well before I bought him. I've been working with him some, but he needs a gentler hand." "I can do that," Louisa said. "It'll take time, though. Horses that have been mistreated need patience." "Time we have," Fletcher replied. "I'd rather do it right than fast." They worked through the morning, and Louisa found herself falling into a rhythm with Fletcher that felt natural. He was strong enough to handle the heavy work without seeming to strain, moving 100-pound feed sacks like they weighed nothing. But he was also careful and thoughtful, never rushing or using force when patience would work better. The gelding, a beautiful bay with a white star on his forehead, was indeed skittish. He shied away when Louisa first approached him, his ears flat against his head. She spent an hour just standing in the corral with him, not trying to touch him or catch him, just being a presence. Fletcher watched from outside the fence, his arms resting on the top rail. "You're patient," he observed. "Horses respond to patience better than force," Louisa said. "He needs to learn that people won't hurt him. That takes time." By midday, the gelding had approached her twice, sniffing her outstretched hand before retreating. It was progress, small but real. Fletcher suggested they break for lunch, and Louisa was surprised to find she'd been working for 6 hours straight without noticing. They ate together outside, sitting on the bench Fletcher had built alongside his cabin. He'd made sandwiches with thick slices of bread and venison, and produced fresh carrots from his root cellar. The food was simple but good, and Louisa ate with an appetite she hadn't felt in weeks. "Tell me about Missouri," Fletcher said as they ate. "What was it like growing up there?" Louisa found herself talking, telling him about the small farm, about her father teaching her to ride before she could walk, about her mother's garden and the way the fireflies would light up the summer evenings. She told him about the fever that took them both within a week of each other, leaving her alone at 20 with nothing but a failing farm and debts she couldn't pay. "I'm sorry," Fletcher said quietly. "Losing family is hard." "You lost someone too," Louisa said. It wasn't a question. She could hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes. "My brother," Fletcher said. "At Shiloh, I was 19, he was 17. Should never have been there, but he lied about his age to enlist with me. I couldn't keep him safe." "That wasn't your fault." "Maybe not. But it feels like it was sometimes." He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to shake off the dark mood. "But that's past. Can't change it, can only keep moving forward." The afternoon passed in more work. Louisa spent time with each of the horses, assessing their temperaments and training levels. Some were well started, others barely halter broke. She made mental notes about which ones would need the most work and which could be ready for sale sooner. Fletcher worked the cattle, riding out to check on them in the high meadow. Louisa watched him ride away on the big gray gelding, sitting the horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent half his life in a saddle. There was something compelling about watching him, the way he moved with such purpose and strength. She shook her head, trying to clear the thought. She was here to work, not to develop foolish feelings for her employer. Fletcher had been nothing but professional and kind, and she wasn't going to repay that by making things complicated. But over the following days and weeks, Louisa found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way her heart sped up when Fletcher smiled at her, or the warmth that spread through her chest when he praised her work. He was unfailingly respectful, always maintaining proper distance, but there were moments when their hands would brush passing tools or when their eyes would meet across the corral that made her think she might not be alone in her feelings. The work itself was deeply satisfying. The bay gelding, whom Louisa had named Copper, slowly began to trust her. By the end of the second week, he would come to her call and let her handle him all over. By the end of the third week, she had a saddle on him and was doing groundwork, teaching him to respond to pressure and release. Fletcher watched her work with obvious admiration. "You have a gift," he said one evening as she put Copper back in his stall. "I've never seen anyone work with horses like you do." "It's not a gift," Louisa said, though she felt pleased by the compliment. "It's just patience and understanding. Horses want to trust us. We just have to prove we're trustworthy." "I think that applies to more than horses," Fletcher said, and there was something in his voice that made Louisa look up at him sharply. But he'd already turned away, heading toward the barn door. "I'm going into Fairplay tomorrow for supplies. Want to come along?" "I'd like that," Louisa said. "I need a few things." The trip to Fairplay the next morning was Louisa's first time back in town since the day she'd met Fletcher. They took the wagon, Fletcher driving while Louisa sat beside him. The trail down from the high country was steep in places, but Fletcher handled the horses expertly, keeping the wagon steady. Fairplay sat in the broad South Park Basin, a mining town that had boomed in the 60s and was now settling into more permanent existence. The main street was lined with wooden buildings, some painted, most not. There was a general store, a bank, a saloon, and a hotel. People moved along the boardwalks with purpose, miners and ranchers and townspeople all mixing together. Fletcher pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped Louisa down. His hands at her waist were strong and warm, and he held on just a moment longer than necessary before releasing her. Their eyes met, and Louisa felt her breath catch. "Fletcher Barnes, as I live and breathe." The moment broke as a woman came bustling out of the store, a broad smile on her weathered face. She was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," Fletcher said warmly. "Good to see you. And who's this, Mrs.?" Patterson asked, looking at Louisa with undisguised curiosity. "This is Louisa Jane. She's working for me now, helping with the horses." "Working for you?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "Well, that's wonderful. Fletcher's needed help for ages but been too stubborn to ask for it." "You treating her right, Barnes. $18 a month plus room and board," Louisa said, unable to help the smile that crossed her face. "Better than fair." "I should say so. That's more than most men make around here. Good for you, Fletcher. Your mother would be proud, seeing you treat people decent." They spent the next hour gathering supplies. Fletcher insisted on buying Louisa anything she needed, saying it fell under the room and board agreement. She tried to protest, but he was immovable on the subject. "You're working hard. You need good boots and a proper coat for when winter comes. Consider it part of your wages." Louisa finally agreed, secretly pleased by his concern. She picked out sturdy work boots and a warm wool coat, along with fabric to make new shirts and small luxuries like soap and coffee. As they were loading the wagon, Sutton appeared across the street. He saw them and his face darkened, but he made no move to approach. Fletcher noticed him too, and Louisa felt him tense beside her. "Ignore him," she said quietly. "He's not worth the trouble." "If he bothers you, you tell me," Fletcher said, his voice hard. "I won't have him harassing you." "He won't," Louisa said with more confidence than she felt. "But thank you." They headed back up into the mountains, the wagon laden with supplies. The day was warm, the sky a brilliant blue, and Louisa found herself relaxing into the journey. Fletcher told her stories about the area, pointing out landmarks and sharing the history he'd learned from the older prospectors and ranchers. "That peak there is Silver Heels," he said, indicating a mountain to the south. "Named after a dance hall girl who stayed to nurse people during a smallpox epidemic back in the 60s. They say she wore silver heels on her shoes. She survived the pox, but it scarred her face and she disappeared afterward. Some say she still wanders these mountains." "That's sad," Louisa said. "She saved people and then felt she had to hide." "People can be cruel about things that don't matter," Fletcher agreed. "Beauty fades, but character lasts. She was a hero, scars or not." The way he said it with such conviction made Louisa's heart warm. Fletcher was a good man, through and through. She was increasingly certain of that. Back at the cabin, they unloaded the supplies together, working in comfortable silence. It was late afternoon by the time they finished, and Louisa should have been tired, but she felt energized. She decided to work with Copper some more before dinner, wanting to build on the progress they'd made. Fletcher watched from his usual spot at the fence as she worked the bay gelding on a long line, asking him to move in circles at different speeds. Copper was responding beautifully, his ears forward, his movements fluid and relaxed. "He's ready for you to ride him," Fletcher called. "Not quite yet," Louisa called back. "Another few days of groundwork, then we'll see." But Fletcher was right. 3 days later, Louisa swung into Copper's saddle for the first time. The gelding tensed but didn't panic, and after a moment he began to walk, responding to her gentle cues. By the end of the session, they were trotting smoothly around the corral, and Louisa was grinning so widely her face hurt. Fletcher was grinning too when she finally dismounted. "That was beautiful. You're an artist, Louisa." "Copper did all the work," she said, but she was glowing with pride. "He's going to be an excellent horse for someone." "Shame to sell him then," Fletcher said. "Maybe you should keep him." "Keep him?" Louisa looked at him in surprise. "Consider it a bonus. You've earned it, and you two work well together. Every good horsewoman needs her own horse." Louisa felt tears prick her eyes. She'd had to sell her horses in Missouri to pay debts, and she'd missed having her own mount more than she could say. "Fletcher, I can't accept that. He's worth at least $100. "Then work it off in trade," Fletcher said. "I don't care. Point is, he's yours if you want him." "I want him," Louisa said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much." "You're welcome," Fletcher said softly, and when their eyes met, Louisa saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. It was more than kindness, more than respect. It was desire and warmth, and something that might have been the beginning of love. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Fletcher took a step toward her, and Louisa's heart began to race. But then a voice called from the trail, breaking the spell. "Hello, the camp." Fletcher turned, his expression shifting to one of caution. A man on horseback was approaching, wearing a sheriff's star on his vest. "Sheriff Thomas," Fletcher called back. "What brings you up here?" The sheriff was a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He dismounted and shook Fletcher's hand, then tipped his hat to Louisa. "Madam, Fletcher, just making rounds, checking on folks. Wanted to give you a heads up that there's been some trouble down in the basin." "What kind of trouble?" Fletcher asked, his voice sharpening. "Cattle rustling." Lost about 30 head from the Williams Ranch last week. Tracks suggest they drove them up into the high country before heading east. Just want folks to be vigilant, keep an eye on their stock. I'll do that, Fletcher said. How's Williams taking it? About as well as you'd expect. That's most of his herd. He's talking about selling out, moving back east. The sheriff's gaze moved to Louisa. You're the young lady who was going to work for Sutton, aren't you? Was being the operative word, Louisa said. I work for Fletcher now. Smart decision. Sutton's been complaining all over town about how Barnes here stole his worker. The sheriff smiled slightly. Most folks are taking Barnes's side for what it's worth. Sutton's not popular. I didn't steal anyone, Fletcher said firmly. I offered fair wages for honest work, that's all. I know that and you know that. Just wanted you aware that Sutton's been talking. Man like him, when he feels slighted, sometimes he does stupid things. Keep an eye out. After the sheriff left, Fletcher was quiet, his jaw tight with tension. Louisa touched his arm gently. You think Sutton would try something? I don't know, Fletcher admitted. But Thomas is right. Sutton holds grudges. I'll need to be more careful checking the stock, maybe move the horses closer to the cabin at night. I'll help, Louisa said. We're in this together. Fletcher looked at her and some of the tension left his shoulders. Together. I like the sound of that. Over the following weeks, they fell into a new routine that included extra vigilance. Fletcher checked the cattle every morning and evening, and they brought the horses into the corrals near the barn each night instead of leaving them in the larger pasture. It was more work, but it provided peace of mind. Louisa continued working with the horses and began training 2 more after Copper. Fletcher watched whenever he could, clearly fascinated by her methods. They began eating dinner together more often, taking turns cooking in Fletcher's larger cabin. The arrangement felt natural, comfortable, and Louisa found herself looking forward to those evenings more than anything else. They talked about everything during those dinners. Fletcher told her about his childhood in Illinois, about learning to farm from his father and how different it had been from the ranching life he'd built in Colorado. Louisa shared memories of Missouri, of her parents, and the life she'd left behind. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd like to see, dreams for the future. I'd like to build this place into something that lasts, Fletcher said one evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge. Not just for me, but for a family. I always thought I'd have a wife and children someday, but after the war, I couldn't imagine bringing that kind of responsibility into my life. The nightmares, the anger I felt, it didn't seem fair to ask someone to share that. You still feel that way? Louisa asked quietly. Fletcher was silent for a long moment. No, he finally said. Not anymore. The mountains healed something in me, and lately I've started thinking about that future again, about what it might look like. Louisa's heart was pounding. She wanted to ask if she was part of that imagined future, but she couldn't quite find the courage. Instead, she said, "You'd make a good father. You're patient and kind. Any child would be lucky to have you." "Any woman would be lucky to have you," Fletcher replied, turning to look at her directly. "You're strong, intelligent, skilled. You face challenges head-on without complaint. You're beautiful inside and out." The compliment, so earnest and direct, made Louisa's cheeks heat. "Fletcher, I'm not saying this to make you uncomfortable," he continued. "I just want you to know that I see you, Louisa, not just as my employee, but as a woman I've come to care about deeply. If that's unwelcome, tell me now and I'll never mention it again. But if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I'd like to know." Louisa's breath caught. This was the moment, the question she'd been both hoping for and dreading, because once she answered, everything would change. "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same way. I have for weeks now, but I didn't know if it was appropriate, or if you might think I was taking advantage, or... Fletcher reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused palm warm against hers. There's no advantage being taken. We're equals, Louisa. In work and in this, if you're willing. I'm willing, she said, looking up into his eyes. I'm very willing. He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that made her heart skip, and then he was leaning toward her. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question being asked and answered. But then Louisa's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, and the kiss deepened. Fletcher's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Louisa felt safe and desired and home all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for so long. So have I, Louisa admitted. I thought I was going crazy, working beside you every day and wanting to touch you so badly. We'll take this slow, Fletcher said. I want to court you properly, do this right. We're living alone together on a mountain, Louisa pointed out with a laugh. I think we've already bent propriety quite a bit. Then we'll bend it our way, Fletcher said. What matters is that we're honest with each other and we treat each other with respect. The rest is just other people's opinions. They stayed outside for another hour, talking and stealing kisses under the stars. When Louisa finally made her way back to her cabin, she felt like she was floating. Fletcher Barnes, this incredible man who'd shown her such kindness and respect, cared for her, wanted her. It seemed almost too good to be true. The next morning, everything felt different and yet the same. They still worked together, still maintained their routines, but now there were stolen glances and casual touches. Fletcher's hand at the small of her back as they walked to the barn. Louisa's fingers brushing his as she passed him tools. Small intimacies that spoke of their growing connection. That afternoon, as Louisa was working with one of the younger horses, a mare named Daisy, they heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Fletcher immediately went tense, his hand moving to the rifle he now kept nearby. But it was the sheriff again, and his face was grim. Fletcher, Miss Jane. We've got a problem. Found 2 of Williams's missing cattle on Sutton's property this morning. When we confronted him about it, he claimed you must have planted them there, Barnes. Said you've been trying to ruin him ever since you stole his worker. That's absurd, Louisa said hotly. Fletcher's been here working his own land. I know that, madam, and so does anyone with sense. But Sutton's making a lot of noise and some folks are listening. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow at the saloon. I need you both to come into town and set the record straight. Fletcher's jaw was tight. This is ridiculous. I have no interest in Sutton's affairs. I just want to run my ranch in peace. I believe you, Sheriff Thomas said. But we need to handle this proper, like through the law. Come to town tomorrow, let everyone hear both sides, the truth will out. After the sheriff left, Fletcher paced like a caged animal, fury radiating off him. That snake. He's doing this because you chose to work for me instead of him, using you to get at me. Then we'll go to town and tell them the truth, Louisa said firmly. We have nothing to hide and people will see that. I don't like bringing you into this. Sutton's dangerous when he's cornered. I'm already in it, Louisa pointed out. And I'm not afraid of him. We'll face this together just like everything else. Fletcher stopped pacing and looked at her, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Together, he repeated. All right, we'll go to town tomorrow and clear this up. That evening they made plans. They would ride down together at first light, speak at the meeting, and return the same day. Fletcher was insistent that they not stay overnight in town, wanting to get back to protect his property. You really think Sutton would try to steal from you while we're gone? Louisa asked. I think he's desperate and vengeful. That's a bad combination. Fletcher looked at her seriously. If things get dangerous tomorrow, I want you to get somewhere safe. Don't try to protect me or stand up to Sutton. Just get to safety. I'm not leaving you to face trouble alone, Louisa said stubbornly. Louisa, please. I can handle myself in a fight if it comes to that. But I can't protect you and defend myself at the same time. Promise me you'll be smart. She didn't want to promise, but she could see the genuine worry in his eyes. I'll be careful, she finally said. But so will you. They rode into Fairplay the next morning under a gray sky that threatened rain. The town was busier than usual, word of the meeting having apparently spread. People watched as Fletcher and Louisa rode past, some nodding in greeting, others whispering among themselves. The saloon was packed when they arrived. Sheriff Thomas had set up a table at one end of the room, and he stood behind it with a gavel, trying to bring order to the crowd. Sutton stood near the bar, surrounded by several of his ranch hands. He watched Fletcher and Louisa enter with cold, calculating eyes. "Let's get started," Sheriff Thomas called. "This isn't a trial, it's a community meeting to get to the truth. Sutton, you've made accusations. Let's hear your evidence." Sutton stepped forward, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "I'm saying Barnes here has been trying to ruin me ever since I hired that girl." He pointed at Louisa. "He offered her inflated wages just to spite me, then probably helped himself to some cattle while he was at it. Those cows found on my property. He put them there to make me look bad." "That's a lie," Fletcher said, his voice calm but hard as iron. "I've never set foot on your property without invitation, and I have no interest in your affairs. I offered Miss Jane fair wages for honest work because you were trying to cheat her. That's all there is to it." "Fair wages," Sutton sneered. $18 a month for a woman. That's not fair, that's stupidity. Or maybe you're getting something else out of the arrangement." The insinuation was clear, and Fletcher took a step forward, fury blazing in his eyes. Louisa grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what he wants." Fletcher stopped, breathing hard, but he didn't move toward Sutton again. Instead, he looked around the room, addressing everyone present. "I came to Colorado after the war looking for peace," he said. "I built my ranch with my own hands, and I've worked hard to be a good neighbor and a fair dealer. I've never cheated anyone or stolen anything. The accusation Sutton makes is false, and I believe everyone here knows it. He's angry because I wouldn't let him exploit Miss Jane, and this is his revenge." "Why should we believe you over him?" one of Sutton's hands called out. "Because I have witnesses," Fletcher said. "I've been on my property every day since I bought Williams's cattle. Mrs. Patterson at the general store can confirm I was in town the day before the cattle went missing. My property is 5 miles up the mountain, and the trail is rough. There's no way I could have moved cattle from Williams's place to Sutton's land without being seen by half the county." Sheriff Thomas nodded. "That matches what I found in my investigation. The timing doesn't work for Barnes to be the thief. But Sutton, you've been having money troubles, haven't you? Word is you're behind on your mortgage." Sutton's face went red. "That's private business." "It's relevant business," the sheriff countered. "If you're desperate for money, might be tempted to steal some cattle and sell them. Especially if you could pin it on someone else while you're at it." The crowd began murmuring, and Louisa could see the tide of opinion shifting. People who'd been uncertain now looked at Sutton with suspicion. He must have sensed it too, because his hand moved toward his belt. "I won't be called a thief by the likes of you," Sutton snarled, and suddenly there was a gun in his hand. Everything happened at once. Fletcher shoved Louisa behind him, several people screamed, and Sheriff Thomas drew his own weapon. "Put it down, Sutton," the sheriff ordered. "Put it down now." But Sutton wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at Fletcher, his eyes wild. "This is your fault, all of it. If you just minded your own business, none of this would have happened." "I'm not going to let you shoot an innocent man," Fletcher said calmly. though Louisa could feel the tension in his body where she pressed against his back. "Whatever trouble you're in, this isn't the answer. You don't get to tell me what to do." Sutton's hand shook, the gun wavering. The sound of the gun cocking was obscenely loud in the sudden silence, but it wasn't Sutton's gun. It was the sheriff's, now aimed directly at the rancher's head. "Last warning, Sutton. Drop it or I drop you." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sutton's hand lowered and the gun clattered to the floor. He seemed to deflate, all the fury draining out of him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "I just needed money. The cattle were right there and nobody was watching." "So you did steal them," the sheriff said. "And then tried to blame Fletcher when you got caught." Sutton didn't answer, but his silence was confession enough. The sheriff gestured to two men standing nearby. "Take him to the jail. He'll stand trial proper." As Sutton was led away, Fletcher finally turned to Louisa. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her hands were shaking. "Are you?" "I've been through worse," Fletcher said, but his eyes were concerned as he looked her over. "Let's go home." They rode back to the high country in silence, both processing what had happened. The rain that had been threatening finally started to fall, a gentle drizzle that slowly soaked through their clothes. But neither of them suggested stopping to wait it out. Back at the ranch, Fletcher insisted on checking all the stock before they did anything else, making sure nothing had been disturbed while they were gone. Everything was fine, all the animals accounted for, but Louisa could see the tension still riding Fletcher's shoulders. "Come to my cabin," she said, taking his hand. "Let me make you coffee and we can warm up by the stove." Fletcher let himself be led, and once inside Louisa's small cabin, she stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. Fletcher sat at her table, his hair dripping, his shirt clinging to his muscular frame. Louisa found herself staring at him at the way the firelight played across his features. "I was terrified," she admitted. "When Sutton pulled that gun, I thought he was going to shoot you." "He wouldn't have," Fletcher said. "He's a bully and a thief, but I don't think he's a killer, not really." "You don't know that, you can't know that." Louisa moved to stand in front of him, her hands coming up to frame his bearded face. "You could have died, Fletcher. And I realized in that moment that I can't lose you. I won't survive losing you." Fletcher's hands came up to cover hers, his eyes intense. "You won't lose me, I promise you that." "You can't promise that. Life is uncertain, but I can promise you this." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love you, Fletcher Barnes. I don't care if it's too soon or if people think it's improper. I love you and I want to build a life with you here in these mountains, if you'll have me." Fletcher stood, and suddenly he was kissing her with a fierce intensity that stole her breath. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her against his broad chest, and Louisa clung to him, pouring all her fear and love and desire into the kiss. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too. I think I have since that first morning when you stood up to Sutton. I want to marry you, Louisa Jane. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build this ranch with you, raise a family with you. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Louisa breathed. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Fairplay, with Mrs. Patterson and Sheriff Thomas standing as witnesses. Louisa wore a dress of pale blue that Mrs. Patterson helped her sew, and Fletcher wore his best clothes, his hair trimmed and his beard neatly groomed. He looked impossibly handsome, and the way he looked at Louisa as they exchanged vows made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The minister pronounced them man and wife, and Fletcher kissed her there in front of everyone, a declaration of love and commitment that made Louisa's heart soar. They spent their wedding night in Fletcher's cabin, which was now their cabin. Fletcher carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and then he set her down gently, his expression turning serious. "I want you to know that you can always say no," he said quietly. "To anything. You're my wife, but you're also your own person, and I'll always respect that." Louisa reached up and kissed him softly. "I know that. It's one of the reasons I love you, but I'm not saying no tonight." Their lovemaking was tender and passionate, Fletcher's strength tempered by gentleness, his desire matched by reverence. He made Louisa feel cherished and desired and whole, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, she felt like she'd finally found where she belonged. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Louisa's life. She and Fletcher worked the ranch together during the day and fell into each other's arms at night. They talked about their plans, about expanding the horse operation, about eventually hiring more help so they could take trips to Denver or even back east to visit Fletcher's family in Illinois. As summer faded into fall, Louisa began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be sure, not wanting to get Fletcher's hopes up prematurely. But by October, there was no doubt, and she told him one evening over dinner, Fletcher's face transformed with joy. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We're having a baby. We're going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Louisa asked, though the answer was obvious. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Fletcher said. "You've given me everything I ever wanted, Louisa. A home, love, and now a family. I'm the luckiest man alive." Winter came to the high country with dramatic force, snow piling up in deep drifts and temperatures plunging below zero. But inside their cabin, wrapped in Fletcher's arms with a fire crackling in the hearth, Louisa had never felt warmer. They spent the long winter evenings planning for the baby, Fletcher building a cradle from smooth pine and Louisa sewing tiny clothes. The horses were safe in the barn, the cattle in the lower meadow where they could shelter from the worst of the storms. Fletcher checked on them daily, breaking trails through the snow with tireless energy. Louisa watched him work from the cabin window, marveling at his strength and dedication. In late February, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow, Sheriff Thomas made his way up the mountain to check on them. He brought news that Sutton had been convicted of cattle theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His ranch had been sold to pay his debts. "Good riddance," Mrs. Patterson had come with the sheriff, bringing supplies and gossip. "That man caused nothing but trouble. How are you feeling, dear?" She looked at Louisa's swelling belly with warm eyes. "Wonderful," Louisa said honestly. "I've never been better." "That's what love and a good man will do for you," Mrs. Patterson said with satisfaction. "Fletcher, you take good care of her, you hear?" "Every day of my life," Fletcher promised, his hand finding Louisa's and squeezing gently. As winter gave way to spring, the mountains came alive with color. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows, and the aspen trees leafed out in brilliant green. Louisa's belly grew round and heavy, and Fletcher fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," Louisa protested one afternoon when Fletcher tried to take over her horse training duties completely. "I know that. But humor me. You're carrying the most precious cargo in the world." Louisa couldn't argue with that, especially since she was getting tired more easily. She compromised by doing lighter work, focusing on groundwork with the horses rather than riding them. In early May, as apple blossoms were blooming on the wild trees near the stream, Louisa went into labor. Fletcher had ridden down to fetch Mrs. Patterson days earlier, and the older woman had been staying with them just in case. She took charge immediately, sending Fletcher to boil water and gather supplies while she helped Louisa through the contractions. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Fletcher stayed by Louisa's side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. His strength was a rock she clung to as the waves of pain washed over her. Finally, as the sun was climbing over the eastern peaks, their son was born. He came into the world wailing, his tiny fists waving, and Louisa felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "He's perfect," Fletcher breathed, tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Patterson placed the baby in his arms. "Louisa, he's perfect. You're perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much." They named him Thomas Fletcher Barnes, after the sheriff who had been such a good friend to them and after his father. Tommy, as they called him, had Fletcher's dark hair and Louisa's blue eyes. And from the start, he had his father wrapped completely around his tiny finger. Fletcher was an attentive, devoted father. He would walk the floor with Tommy for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in his deep voice. He changed diapers without complaint and got up for middle-of-the-night feedings to bring Tommy to Louisa. Watching him with their son made Louisa fall in love with him all over again. The summer passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and stolen moments of sleep. But it was also filled with joy, watching Tommy grow and change every day. By fall, he was smiling and cooing, responding to his parents' voices with obvious delight. Louisa gradually returned to working with the horses, bringing Tommy with her in a sling Fletcher had fashioned. The baby seemed to love being outside, watching the animals with wide, curious eyes. Copper, now fully trained and Louisa's constant companion, was gentle around the baby, seeming to understand the precious nature of the tiny human. That winter was easier than the last, partly because they knew what to expect and partly because they had Tommy to keep them entertained. The cabin rang with laughter as they watched their son discover his hands, his feet, the joy of making noise by banging things together. Fletcher's ranch continued to thrive. The horses Louisa trained sold for premium prices, and word was spreading about the quality of their stock. They were able to expand the cattle herd and add more horses. Fletcher hired a young man named Sam to help with the heavy work, giving him the cabin Louisa had first lived in. By the time Tommy was walking, stumbling around the cabin on unsteady legs, Louisa was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Fletcher was still protective but slightly less frantic, having learned that his wife was stronger than she looked. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after both their mothers, was born in March of 1879 during a late spring snowstorm. She had Fletcher's brown eyes and Louisa's blonde hair, and she was the most placid baby Louisa had ever seen, content to nurse and sleep and watch the world with calm observation. Tommy, now almost 2, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit next to her cradle for hours, talking to her in his own private language, bringing her his favorite toys to share. "We've got 2 beautiful children," Fletcher said one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset, Tommy playing at their feet and Margaret sleeping in Louisa's arms. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life." "Our life," Louisa corrected with a smile. "And it's wonderful, isn't it? Better than wonderful. It's everything I never knew I needed." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and hard work and deep love. Tommy grew into a strong, confident boy who loved the ranch and the animals, following his father everywhere and trying to copy everything he did. Margaret was quieter, thoughtful, with a gift for gentling even the most difficult horses. Louisa saw herself in her daughter, that same patience and understanding of animals. They had 2 more children over the years, another son named James and finally another daughter, Catherine. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, Fletcher adding rooms with his own hands. The ranch expanded too, becoming one of the most successful operations in the South Park Basin. Louisa never forgot those early days, though. The desperation that had driven her to fair play, the humiliation of Sutton's insulting offer, the miracle of Fletcher stepping in when she needed help most. She and Fletcher often told their children the story of how they met, wanting them to understand the importance of treating people fairly and standing up for what was right. "Your father saved me," Louisa would say. "You saved yourself," Fletcher would always correct. "You just needed someone to give you a fair chance. You did the rest." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Fletcher surprised Louisa by taking her back to the spot where they'd first kissed, that bench outside their cabin. It was a warm summer evening, and they could hear their children playing down by the stream, their laughter carrying on the breeze. 20 years, Fletcher said, taking her hand. "And I love you more now than I did the day we married." "I love you too," Louisa said, leaning against his solid shoulder. "Thank you for giving me this life, Fletcher, for seeing me when others wouldn't." "Thank you for taking a chance on me," Fletcher replied, "for trusting me when you had no reason to, for building this dream with me." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, surrounded by everything they'd built together. 4 children, a thriving ranch, a love that had only grown stronger with time. It was more than either of them had dared hope for that long-ago day, when desperation had brought them together. Tommy, now 22, had taken on more responsibility around the ranch, showing a natural talent for both the horse and cattle operations. He'd recently started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart, capable young woman named Emily, who reminded Louisa of herself at that age. Margaret, at 19, was the finest horse trainer Louisa had ever seen, surpassing even her mother's skill. She had suitors, but so far none had caught her interest. She was too busy with her beloved horses to worry about romance, she said, though Louisa suspected the right man just hadn't come along yet. James, at 15, was already taller than Fletcher and still growing. He had his father's strength and gentle nature, and was beloved by his younger sister Catherine, who was 12 and the baby of the family, spoiled by everyone but somehow still sweet-natured and kind. As the years continued to pass, Fletcher and Louisa watched their children grow into remarkable adults. Tommy married Emily in a beautiful ceremony on the ranch, and within a year, they welcomed Fletcher and Louisa's first grandchild, a boy they named Fletcher Thomas after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, Fletcher had tears in his eyes. "Our legacy," he said softly to Louisa. "This is what it's all about, isn't it? Building something that lasts beyond us." Margaret eventually fell in love with a traveling horse trader from Wyoming, a man as passionate about horses as she was. Their courtship was conducted partly through letters and partly during his frequent visits, and when he finally proposed, Margaret accepted with joy. They settled on a ranch in Wyoming, close enough to visit but far enough to build their own life. James surprised everyone by deciding he wanted to study veterinary medicine. Fletcher and Louisa encouraged him, proud of his ambition even though it meant he'd leave the ranch for a while to attend school. He promised to come back and use his skills to help not just their ranch but all the ranchers in the area. Catherine, their youngest, proved to have a talent for business. By the time she was 16, she was managing the ranch's books and negotiating sales with a skill that impressed even the most hardened buyers. She had plans to expand their operation even further, to start shipping horses back east where the demand was high. Fletcher and Louisa stepped back gradually, letting their children take over more of the daily operations. They were in their 50s now, still healthy and strong but ready to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They took trips they'd always talked about, traveling to Denver and even to San Francisco to see the ocean. But they always came back to their mountain, to the cabin Fletcher had built with his own hands, to the life they'd created together. It was here, surrounded by mountains and pine trees and the sound of running water, that they were happiest. On quiet evenings, they would sit together outside their cabin, Fletcher's arm around Louisa's shoulders, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they reminisced about the past, about that first meeting and the struggles they'd overcome. More often, they talked about the present, about their children and grandchildren, about plans for the future. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked one evening. They were in their 60s now, their hair gray but their love as strong as ever. "Taking a chance on a stranger in the mountains." "Not for a single moment," Louisa said. "You gave me more than fair wages, Fletcher. You gave me respect, partnership, love. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Fletcher corrected, pulling her closer. "That's what love is, isn't it? Not one person saving another, but two people building something better together than either could have done alone." Louisa smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. Tommy and Emily lived in a house they'd built on the property, raising their 3 children. Margaret and her husband visited frequently, bringing their 2 children to stay for long summers. James had returned from school and set up a veterinary practice in Fairplay, riding up to the ranch several times a week to check on the animals. Catherine had married a banker's son, and together they were expanding the ranch's business reach, while still living in the cabin Sam had once occupied. The original cabin, the one where Fletcher and Louisa had fallen in love and raised their family, remained theirs. It had been renovated and expanded over the years, but the heart of it was still that simple structure Fletcher had built with his own hands all those years ago. As they sat there, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd called home for more than 40 years, Fletcher and Louisa reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with injustice, with a rancher trying to cheat a desperate woman and a mountain man who couldn't stand by and watch it happen. But it had grown into something beautiful, a love story that had created ripples spreading far beyond that initial meeting. "Tell me again," Fletcher said, his voice soft in the gathering twilight. "Tell me you're happy." "I'm happy," Louisa said, and it was the absolute truth. "I'm so very happy, my love." They sat together as night fell, 2 people who had found each other against the odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. The mountains stood eternal around them, silent witnesses to a love that had weathered every storm and only grown stronger. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, their children talking, the sounds of the family they'd created together. It was everything they'd ever wanted, everything they'd worked for, everything they'd dreamed of during those early days when they were just a desperate woman and a mountain man who chose to do the right thing. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had built an empire of love that would last for generations. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Fletcher kissed Louisa's forehead gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saying yes that day, for trusting me, for loving me." "Thank you," Louisa whispered back, "for seeing me, for valuing me, for loving me exactly as I am." They stayed there until the moon rose, silver and bright over the mountain peaks, illuminating the land they'd made their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, they simply sat together, 2 souls who had found their home in each other, grateful for every moment of the extraordinary life they'd shared. The end.